a very warm welcome to you here on the Times Now Summit. Such a pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Mr. Tewari, I'm going to start by asking you whether you think you should be changing your mind about the title of your book. On January 12th, you release a book called A World Adrift. And after that, crazy things start happening. You have the president of a country who's abducted, you have the head of a state who is assassinated, and then a war breaks out. Is this a world that is adrift, or is this a world completely topsy-turvy?
Well, Shreya, I didn't instigate it, and neither did the book. So I think those trends were very, very intrinsically visible for a fairly long period of time. The United States, which was exhausted after the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which cost them about $8 trillion and a lot of blood in the process, was really an exhausted power by the end of it. And so therefore, there was a power vacuum which loomed on the horizon. And then COVID-19 happened. And post-COVID-19, when the Trump administration came back for the second time, possibly they discerned that the strategic vacuum had only perpetuated itself, perhaps to the advantage of its greatest strategic rival, China. And the assertiveness that you see, whether in Venezuela or Iran, if you really look at it in the broader context, it has more to do with China than even with the stuff which is happening in the Middle East.
We'll come to that in just a bit. But can I ask you, I'm just going to quote Mr. Yashwant Singh, who was at your book launch, and he made a very pertinent, Yashwant Sinha, I beg your pardon, and he makes a pertinent remark. I'm just going to quote him here. He says, the Parliament does not have time anymore to discuss important issues because the unimportant, he says, has become central. I want to ask you, whose fault is it, sir? Is it the opposition's? Is it the government's? For example, day before yesterday, an all-party meeting is called. The leader of opposition decides not to go. All right, his mother was unwell. He was by her bedside. I understand that. But even before that, he had decided not to go. You have a party like the TMC that decides to skip it. I want to ask you how you read what happened at the all-party meeting and whether the absence of the leader of opposition was called for, given the fact that he had the maximum questions for the government.
Well, I think what was very surprising was the absence of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the leader of the House. The Prime Minister addressed the Lok Sabha and laid out what he thought were the strategic concerns of India. Next day, he went and did the same thing in the Council of States, the Rajya Sabha. And so therefore, given the fact that we are in an unprecedented situation, whereby not only is our crude oil supply impacted, not only is our LNG supplies impacted, but fertilizer, food, essential pharmaceuticals. I think it was incumbent that the Prime Minister, as the leader of the House, should have presided over the meeting. That would have lent a different gravitas altogether, and possibly a lot of other people who did not attend the meeting may have really reconsidered the situation, because this has become a pattern. Earlier, whenever there used to be an all-party meeting, even before the commencement of any parliament session, it was always presided over by the Prime Minister. Unfortunately, over the last couple of years, that has not become an exception. That has become completely absent. And insofar as disturbance is concerned, or the lack of parliament functioning is concerned, that's the problem which now goes back to 1989. If I may remind you, because I do not want to start on a long history, but on the 24th of July 1989, when 106 MPs resigned from the Lok Sabha, essentially all those people who are in government now, on absolutely spurious and fabricated allegations, that set off a domino impact, which unfortunately India's legislative system has not been able to contain till now.
You think it's the government's problem? You think it's the opposition's problem? Or do you think both are at fault? Because the opposition seems, at least the Congress party and the LOP seems to approach Parliament, sir, if I may, as, as enemy territory, where you go in like a gorilla, do your thing and you come out.
See, the Parliament is not a notice board for the government to essentially pin up its stuff. If you look at the complexion of the Lok Sabha, it is 310 to 240, right? So therefore, between the ruling alliance and the opposition alliance, the numbers are even Stevens. So therefore, if Parliament has to function, and function efficaciously, and I'm one of those who's always been a votary that Parliament should function, then under those circumstances, the concerns of the opposition also need to be accommodated. I had once suggested in my previous term to one of the presiding officers of the House that to accommodate the concerns of the opposition, at least thrice a week in the evening after government business stops at 6 o'clock, let there be a Rule 193 discussion whereby the concerns of the opposition also find space. So ultimately, you need to find a modus vivendi, and let me end by saying the responsibility of running the House primarily rests with the government. And that's been the sine qua non of India's democratic system. So therefore, to use the opposition as a whipping boy by first not providing it space is like raising a ghost and slaying it and then calling yourself Superman.
But sir, what does the government do? What does the government do if the opposition comes armed with a couple of jublas? In the recent past, especially since the war has broken out, what have we heard? The Prime Minister is compromised, his foreign policy is a joke, Narendra surrender, etc., etc. If this is the combative attitude that the opposition comes with to Parliament, can you absolve the opposition of all responsibility of running Parliament, sir?
May I ask you a counter question? When was the last time that the Lok Sabha actually discussed the demands for grants of either the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of External Affairs, or for that matter, the Ministry of Home? And I don't recall in the last 12 years, except for perhaps one discussion on the demands for grants of the Ministry of Home, there has been a substantive discussion in Parliament on any of the core ministries of the government. So therefore, when your entire attitude is to obfuscate, to dissimulate, to try and block discussions, in fact, if you were to go through the parliamentary record, you would find that all questions pertaining to sensitive ministries are actually dismissed at the threshold. In fact, I put out a number the last time. Since this parliament began in 2019, 66 of my questions till the previous session on important issues of national security and defense, issues that were pertinent from the country's point of view, were not even admitted. So therefore, how can you possibly have a democratic system functioning when the government is so diffident, so chary, and so insecure about answering fundamental questions? After all, if Parliament is not going to discuss important issues, for example, we have a Rule 193 pending in the House at the moment on the situation in West Asia. It was decided in the Business Advisory Committee that there would be a threadbare discussion on the situation in West Asia because it concerns our diaspora, it concerns our energy security, it concerns our food security. Why is the government not having that discussion?
But they had an all-party meeting. They're saying we answered all your questions there.
An all-party meeting is not a substitute for a discussion in Parliament. There are 543 members who've been elected by over 2 million people at a per constituency. They have their own concerns. They have a right to articulate their concerns. Perhaps I think we would be the only parliament in the world, which has not had a discussion on the situation in the greater Middle East. And I can't understand. The situation in the Middle East is not the creation of the government. You know, as I was pointing out earlier, that we've rather been marginal players in the greater Middle East. So what are you so diffident about? See, as we speak today, the focus has been on crude oil and LNG, but the real impact is going to be on your agricultural sector.
With fertilizers.
Fertilizers. By the time the Rabi sowing season comes, you'll be hugely stressed because 49% of your nitrogen-based fertilizers actually come from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Oman, and Qatar has already shut down the biggest fertilizer producing plant in that country. Qatar Fertilizer runs it, which accounts for about 17% of urea. So therefore, under those circumstances, don't you think it warrants a discussion in Parliament as to how are we going to be diversifying our sources of procurement? And if Parliament is not going to discuss the situation in Middle East or the situation in West Asia, which is the other forum in the country which is going to do it?
Before I get back to the war, my last question on the subject we are debating, look at how other discussions have gone on in Parliament, right? You have the leader of opposition who stands up, and the first things he says is Epstein. Prime Minister is compromised, jawab dijiye. Hardeep Puri, the petroleum minister, you just spoke of petroleum, is telling the country the amount of stocks we have, the challenges we face, etc. There is booing and sloganeering in the backdrop. Dekho, dekho, kaun aaya, Epstein ka dost aaya. If this is how the opposition is going to behave in Parliament, sir, can I ask you whether the government has, a legitimate right in saying, bhai, ab chhodi do discussion?
Well, the government cannot abdicate responsibility and abandon Parliament. And without prejudice, and I am not weighing in on one side or the other, I am just making a factual point that as a consequence of the release of those Epstein files by the United States Department of Justice, there have been resignations and arrests all over the world. There is not a single country in the world which has not been impacted, including royal families. So therefore, if legitimate questions are raised with regard to certain mentions in the Epstein files, why is there so much of diffidence? If the opposition wants a discussion, other parliaments have also discussed it. There's been a discussion in the US House of Congress. In fact, as a consequence of a push by members of the US House of Congress, the Epstein files actually became public. Otherwise, those files would have never become public. So under those circumstances, this is how a parliament really should be functioning. So if the opposition wants a discussion, government should welcome a discussion. After all, the Epstein files have not been released by this government. They've been released by the Department of Justice of the US administration. It contains names of people from all around the world. So why the hesitation? Why the diffidence? Why the ambiguity? So therefore, it can't be my way or the highway. You see, ultimately, Parliament is not a notice board or a pin board of the government, and the opposition has to fall in line like little school kids and actually agree to whatever they have to say.
Mr. Tewari, at the heart of your book is, I'm quoting you here, the struggle of... At the heart of your book is, something you call the struggle of nations, particularly India, to preserve our strategic autonomy, sir. You think under the current circumstances, India has managed to do that?
Look, the situation in West Asia or the greater Middle East is a complex situation. We have diaspora, almost 10 million people in countries all over the greater Middle East, countries which are in an adversarial situation with each other. However, having said that, there are certain traditions of Indian foreign policy which go back all the way to the Asian Relations Conference of 1946, even before India became independent. And under those circumstances, it raises some very pertinent questions. For example, should India be accepting regime change by force? Should India be accepting the abduction of heads of states, the targeted assassination of government functionaries in another sovereign geography? Should India not have condoled the killing of the supreme leader of Iran? After all, condolence resolutions were passed even by the Legislative Assembly of Punjab. Should we not have condoled the killing of 196 innocent school children in a Tomahawk missile strike, which was called out by none other than the New York Times? So under those circumstances, strategic autonomy does not mean silence. Strategic autonomy means that you need to very finely navigate or nimbly navigate what is a difficult situation. But complete silence on very vital questions of foreign policy, which the conflict in West Asia or the conduct of the still biggest outside balancer of power, the hegemon of the world, is currently raising, are questions which go to the very heart of the principles on which Indian foreign policy stands. And that is why it is important that when you talk about strategic autonomy does not mean strategic silence.
But it could mean responsible statecraft, as Mr. Tharoor is saying. And let me just quote you here. I was reading somewhere, you have somewhere said that when you're crossing a river, you feel the pebbles when you cross, right? Because the currents could be going anywhere. You don't want to fall into the water and drown. Therefore, you feel the pebbles and you walk carefully. That's what India is doing. Confrontation, Mr. Tewari, has a cost. Why should we, at this point of time, when the situation is tough for us as well, be willing to pay that cost?
But when you see an alligator in those waters, then you might as well scream. So therefore, you need to tread carefully by feeling the stones under your feet. But if you see a crocodile or an alligator in those waters, you might as well scream and scream very loudly. And that's why I'm saying, you see, there are certain threads which run through the ethos of Indian foreign policy. And I'm not talking about a government here or a government there. It has been a continuum across different governments, even NDA, BJP governments, even governments belonging to the Janata Party or the National Front. And that is why on some of these critical questions, the silence of the government actually comes across as deafening, and I'm being very polite and diplomatic about it.
Okay. You've also argued in your book that navigating an increasingly unstable world will depend as much on internal cohesion as on strategic diplomacy. Help me understand what you mean by internal cohesion, and does that mean political cohesion as well, sir?
So therefore, if you go to the opening chapter of that, or the opening lines of the chapter on national security in my book, so the British actually managed the periphery of India through treaties, right? Because the British were an empire, they had no fixed boundaries, they looked at territory on the periphery as frontiers. When we transited to being a sovereign nation, an independent nation with fixed boundaries, we tried to navigate that through treaties, right? Both in the Northwest and we actually negotiated it through constitutional guarantees, both in the Northwest and in the Northeast. Going all the way back to 1947, across 8 decades, our fundamental national security challenges still lie in the northeast and the northwestern part of India. And that's where the bulk of your minorities live. Of course, there's a challenge in central India, which to a great extent has been surmounted, the problem of left-wing extremism. That's a different problem. But if you look at the northwest and the northeast, that's where you've had the maximum amount of turbulence. So therefore, your greatest antidote or to any external challenge is actually your internal cohesion. And at this point in time, your internal cohesion is stretched very taut. So under those circumstances, any democracy or any government which needs to carry everybody along has to govern from the center. In fact, when you come into government, even if you are coming from an extreme position, you must try and move towards the center, because that is the inflection point of gravity from which you can govern a country as diverse and as complex as India. By keeping the country on the slow boil of polarization, in fact, is the greatest disservice that you can do to our national security.
And is that what has happened in the last 14 years, you think?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Can we just go back to a point that you were making in your initial remarks about how the crisis in the Middle East, the war in the Middle East, the conflict in the Middle East, I don't know how you describe it, please go ahead and and tell us why, has everything to do with China, has a lot to do with China as well. Why do you say that, sir?
So, the regime change or the regime compliance which was brought about in Venezuela was supplying crude to China at on a $15 discount on the Brent. It was the source of lithium and a lot of rare earth minerals. Iran had a similar relationship with China. In fact, the only ships which are still transiting through the through the Straits of Hormuz without any let or hindrance are ICRGC tankers which are bound for China. Coupled with this is also President Trump's repeated assertion that Canada is the 51st state of the United States of America. Now, if you were to look at the entire thing in a larger picture, President Trump wants the North American continent to behave like one political and economic entity, something which has not happened after the Second World War. And then by kneecapping Venezuela and Iran, essentially it is trying to weaken its greatest strategic rival. And if tomorrow Russia is given an off-ramp, already the Central European countries are saying that the oil pipelines need to be opened, then the United States has a weakened China which it can negotiate with on its own terms. So therefore, a lot what is happening in the Middle East does not have anything to do with the Middle East. There are actually multiple wars which are being fought, and the underlying impulse seems to be to try and keep the dominance of the dollar alive in the remaining decades of the 21st century. So look beyond the headlines. It is not only about Israel and Iran. It is also about a larger civilizational conflict in that area. But the overarching theme is the great power rivalry, which is being fought in proxy terms in the Middle East as we speak.
Therefore, you are dismissing the theory / the premise that the United States of America was pushed into this war by Israel?
I don't think a country which has $1 trillion defense budget and which is on the cutting edge of frontier technologies which are going to shape the remaining decades of the 21st century can rarely be pushed around till the time it does not make a strategic choice about what its course of action can be. Having said that, it is also true that the US has military relationships with 19 countries across the greater Middle East. 18 of them are with Islamic states, and one is with Israel. This includes 6 basing arrangements in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in the UAE, to name a few. But the irony is, or the paradox is, that the Middle East policy of the United States since 1948 has been overwhelmingly run by Israel. So that's a factor which you can't discount. But to extrapolate it to say that the United States got pushed into a war with Israel, I don't think any country gets pushed into a war where it needs to invest blood and treasure.
We are almost, okay, our time is up. But can I ask you this one question? Maybe you can take 20 seconds to answer this. We are completing 4 weeks of the war, sir. Who's winning? Because President Trump, right from day one, is saying, we've taken out Iran, कुछ नहीं बचा, नेवी नहीं बचा, एयरफोर्स नहीं बचा, कुछ नहीं बचा. सब कुछ ऐसा लग रहा है बचा ही हुआ है. Who's winning? Who has the advantage right now?
Well, I can tell you who's under stress. And it is the energy-consuming economies of Asia which are under stress. So therefore, the Straits of Hormuz still remains closed. And in fact, what you've done, you've handed over a weapon to all those geographies which preside over all these narrow waterways around the world to now try and weaponize it if they want, and use it for the future. So therefore, the closure of the Straits of Hormuz has set such a bad precedent that it has completely knocked the bottom out of the United Nations Convention of the Laws of Seas, which said that the sea lines of commerce and communication should be freely available to any sovereign nation and to anybody who wants to transit through it. So, in fact, what this conflict has done, it has completely underwritten, it has completely subverted or is rewriting the laws of the maritime world.
Mr. Tewari, we'll leave it here. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been an interesting chat and illuminating chat as well. Thank you so much.